Paul Volcker never had a grand plan to make the world a safer place. Things just turned out that way. Starting in the early 1970s, when he first rose to prominence as a Treasury official, the world kept throwing problems at him. In 1971, it was collapsing confidence in the dollars linked to gold. He helped scrap that link. In 1975, it was the imminent bankruptcy of New York City. Volcker had just become president of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, the most important of the Fed's 12 banks. Richard Ravitch, who headed the state's urban development arm, asked Volcker over dinner how to approach the Fed for a bailout. Volcker said to Ravitch, "If we do it for New York, we'd have to do it for everyone else." The city went elsewhere. But these paled next to three interlocking problems that awaited Volcker shortly after he became Fed chairman in 1979. The first was inflation. It had been rising since the 1960s, and that year revolution in Iran sent oil prices through the roof and inflation into double digits. Volcker set out to crush it by pushing interest rates to an all-time high of 20%. The second problem was that many Latin American countries had borrowed heavily in dollars, and high interest rates threatened their ability to pay the money back. The third problem was that if those countries defaulted, the big American banks that had lent them the money could collapse. Solving those three problems would consume most of Volcker's time in office and set the stage for the prosperity to follow. During the 1970s, American banks were anxious to expand abroad. They took dollars earned by Arab oil exporters and lent them to Latin American governments to finance their trade deficits. By 1982, with the interest rates soaring, it was only a matter of time before something gave. Mexico was running out of foreign currency to service its bank loans. Volcker knew that if it defaulted, a big chunk of the American banking system would be instantly insolvent. So he bought time by having the Fed lend to Mexico to disguise its loss of foreign currency reserves. He hoped a new Mexican president could take office that fall and put in place the economic reforms necessary to restore confidence. But by August, it was clear that this plan would not work. Mexico was going to run out of money long before a new president was in place. On Friday, August 13, Volcker began calling top officials in other countries to arrange bridge loans to tide Mexico over. The next step was to persuade the banks to refinance Mexico's maturing loans for a few more months. For some months, Volcker had been meeting with Mexico's finance minister, Jesus Silva Herzog. Volcker arranged for Herzog and his debt expert, Angel Gurria, to meet with their bankers in New York to try to work out a solution. The stakes were unbelievably high. If Mexico defaulted, some of those banks could be wiped out. Volcker did not think it appropriate to attend a meeting between Mexico and its creditors, and so it was up to Herzog to make the case. The first meeting with a handful of banks and officials from the Fed and Treasury at the New York Fed was tense. It led to a second, bigger meeting the next day with a much larger group of bankers. Herzog was a charismatic and urbane man with a flair for drama. Arriving in Lower Manhattan, Herzog looked up at the headquarters of big American banks and confided to Gurria, "I get the impression that every time we take a step on the sidewalk here in New York, these big buildings shake." He could be grave one moment and hysterically funny the next, which would be a crucial asset in what would prove a tense series of negotiations. At that second, larger meeting, he began by urging the bankers to act in their own interest by giving Mexico more flexibility to pay. "We're out of money, and we think it's in your interest not to force payment," he told them. "In fact, we think it's necessary for you to lend us some more money." As Gurria later recalled, all the bankers understood that if Mexico defaulted, they would have to write down their bank's loans. That would render many of those banks insolvent. They also knew that Brazil and Argentina weren't far behind. But if a single banker balked and called its loan, all the others would do the same, since the last to collect would likely get nothing. But then, nobody would get paid in full. The bankers were angry, confused, and mostly hungry for information. Mexico's debts came in a bewildering array of types and sizes, from short-term loans to leases on oil rigs. Herzog did his best to answer questions, tossing the more technical ones to Gurria. But the truth was they didn't have a lot of answers. As the meeting dragged on and the questions became even harder to answer, Herzog decided to inject some humor into the meeting to ease his creditors' minds. "Listen here," he said. "My name is Jesus, and his is Angel."